In the summer of 1943, the Pacific War reached a new phase. The United States had fought hard to take Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands. The next step was to move closer to Japan's defensive line. The Japanese Army and Navy believed that even if they lost ground, they could slow the American advance. Their strategy depended on distance. If they forced the U.S. to fight far from home, they believed supply lines would break down and progress would stall. The islands scattered across the Pacific were small, rugged, and surrounded by shallow coral reefs. Most had no natural harbors. Moving heavy equipment, fuel, and supplies seemed almost impossible. Japanese engineers built bases in these areas slowly, using hand labor and limited tools. They assumed the Americans faced the same limits. They expected it would take months or even years to turn an island into a working base. In late 1943, Japanese reconnaissance pilots began reporting something strange. From the air, they saw long lines of ships unloading cargo at beaches that had been barren weeks earlier. New piers stretched into the water. Airstrips appeared like scars on the landscape, carved from jungle and coral. Commanders dismissed the first reports. They believed their pilots were mistaken or exaggerating. But the sightings grew more frequent. The truth was that the U.S. Navy had brought in its construction battalions, known as the Seabees. These units were made up of skilled workers, carpenters, welders, electricians, mechanics, many of whom had come straight from civilian jobs. They were trained to fight and to build. Their motto was simple: we build, we fight. When the Marines or Army seized an island, the Seabees landed right behind them, often while sniper fire still came from the tree line. They unloaded bulldozers, cranes, and massive prefabricated pontoons. The pontoons were steel boxes that could be locked together to form floating docks, piers, or even small bridges. Within hours, landing beaches turned into makeshift harbors. On one island in the Solomons, the Japanese left behind nothing but swamp and dense jungle. The Seabees cut through the trees with bulldozers, clearing ground for airfields. They used coral rock crushed by machines to build runways solid enough for heavy bombers. They worked day and night under blackout conditions to avoid drawing enemy aircraft. In just a few weeks, the island had an airstrip, storage tanks for fuel, warehouses for food and ammunition, and hospitals for the wounded. To the Japanese, this speed seemed impossible. One Japanese officer wrote in his diary that he could not believe the reports. He had seen engineers in his own army take half a year to build a single runway. When he arrived at a newly captured American base, he was stunned to find an entire harbor built where only bare coastline had been before. Cranes swung overhead, loading ships with supplies. Planes took off and landed in a steady stream. The effect on Japanese planning was dramatic. Their defensive lines relied on isolated island strongholds. The idea was that each base would force the Americans to pause and build up strength before moving forward. But with the Seabees in action, the Americans never paused for long. While one battle still raged, the next island was already under construction. In one operation, Japanese forces planned a counterattack to destroy a new American base before it could be used. By the time their fleet moved into position, the Seabees had already finished the harbor and runways. American aircraft flew in from the new base and drove off the attack before it began. The speed of construction changed the balance of power overnight. For the Seabees, the work was dangerous and exhausting. Bulldozer operators often worked under sniper fire. Some built airstrips while bombs fell around them. They carried rifles as well as hammers, ready to fight if needed. Many lived in tents pitched in mud, surrounded by swarms of insects and constant heat. They kept going because they knew every hour saved meant fewer American lives lost in future battles. One Marine officer said later that without the Seabees, the island-hopping campaign would have stalled. Infantry could seize an island, but only engineers could make it useful. Without fuel, runways, and docks, victories meant little. As the months passed, Japanese reconnaissance photos told a grim story. Where one month there was ocean and jungle, the next month there were ports filled with supply ships and airfields packed with planes. Japanese officers studied the images in silence. They began to grasp the industrial power of the United States. Factories back home were producing ships, bulldozers, and prefabricated parts faster than they could be sunk or destroyed. The psychological shock was severe. Japanese commanders had believed they could fight a defensive war of attrition. Now they realized that every island lost became a new forward base for the enemy. Their own forces could not replace losses at the same speed. For the first time, some senior officers admitted privately that the war might be unwinnable. By mid-1944, the pattern was clear. The Seabees followed every invasion, moving faster each time. Harbors rose from open water. Airfields appeared on barren coral atolls. Supply depots and fuel tanks spread across islands that had been untouched weeks earlier. This relentless progress drove the Americans closer to Japan itself, leaving the Japanese leadership with fewer options. The sight of a fully built harbor, where none had existed before, became a symbol of American power. To the Japanese officers who saw it with their own eyes, it marked the moment they understood the scale of the challenge they faced. It was not just a battle of armies, but a battle of entire nations' capacity to build, move, and sustain war. The Seabees had shown what that meant in the most direct way possible, by turning empty coastline into a hub of war almost overnight. The island sat alone in the middle of the Pacific, ringed by sharp coral reefs and battered by heavy surf. There was no natural harbor and no safe place for ships to dock. Inland, thick jungle and swamp stretched as far as the eye could see. The terrain was rugged, broken by ridges of volcanic rock and tangled roots. Japanese engineers who had worked on similar islands considered the site unsuitable for any large naval base. At best, they thought a small outpost could survive there, supplied by small boats that ferried cargo through the surf. The United States Navy saw the same island and decided it would become a major forward base. It would need a deep-water port, airfields for fighters and bombers, fuel storage, hospitals, and warehouses for food and ammunition. The challenge was staggering. There were no roads, no docks, no level ground. Everything would have to be built from scratch. The only way to do it was to bring in the Seabees. The Seabees landed right behind the Marines, often while the battle for the island still raged. As soon as a strip of beach was secure, they began unloading heavy equipment. Bulldozers rolled off landing craft, their tracks biting into the sand. Cranes followed, along with trucks and amphibious tractors called LVTs. These machines allowed the Seabees to work at a speed no one had seen before in the Pacific War. The first problem was the coral reef that blocked ships from coming close to shore. The Japanese had counted on this natural barrier to make resupply slow and dangerous. The Seabees brought prefabricated steel pontoons. These were large hollow boxes that locked together like building blocks. Working in teams, the men floated the pontoons into position and bolted them into long causeways. Ships could then pull up alongside, unload cargo, and turn around without grounding on the reef. Within days, makeshift piers stretched out over the water. Cargo moved straight from ship to shore on trucks. What had been an empty beach now functioned like a working harbor. Japanese officers who later saw the site could not understand how it had been done so quickly. While one group built docks, others turned inland to clear ground for airstrips. Bulldozers tore into the jungle, pushing down trees and leveling the uneven terrain. The heat was oppressive, and the work went on around the clock under blackout conditions to avoid attracting enemy bombers. Once the land was cleared, the Seabees crushed coral into a fine, white gravel. This material packed tightly when rolled, forming a hard surface strong enough for heavy aircraft. On some islands, a single runway went from raw jungle to operational airfield in less than 2 weeks. Planes began landing almost as soon as the last roller passed over the coral. Fighters provided immediate protection, while bombers prepared for strikes on nearby enemy positions. Fuel was the next priority. Without gasoline, aircraft and vehicles were useless. The Seabees assembled huge storage tanks from sections shipped in pieces. These tanks rose quickly, surrounded by berms for protection. They also laid pipelines to carry fuel directly from tankers offshore to the storage areas. Alongside the fuel tanks, they built warehouses for food and ammunition. Prefabricated metal buildings arrived in numbered sections. The Seabees bolted them together like giant kits, creating strong, weatherproof structures in a fraction of the time traditional construction would take. They did the same for hospitals, which were needed immediately as wounded men came in from the fighting. The work never stopped. Day and night, machines roared and hammers rang out. The smell of diesel and wet earth hung over the camp. Men worked in shifts, eating quick meals and catching sleep wherever they could. They knew speed mattered. Every day shaved off construction meant fewer lives lost in future battles. The timeline shocked even American commanders. In civilian life, projects of this scale would take months or even years. The Seabees did them in weeks, sometimes in days. On one island, they built an entire harbor complex in just over 10 days. On another, they completed a bomber airfield in 12. The pace was relentless, but it allowed U.S. forces to keep moving forward without pause. Japanese intelligence officers studied captured plans and aerial photographs. They saw long lines of ships anchored where, only weeks before, there had been empty ocean. They saw runways gleaming white against the green jungle, fuel tanks lined up in neat rows, and piers stretching far into the water. They knew how long it would take their own engineers to attempt the same work. The comparison was sobering. The Japanese had relied on geography to slow their enemy. They assumed nature itself would block progress. The Seabees proved them wrong. By using prefabrication, heavy machinery, and around-the-clock labor, they overcame every obstacle. No coral reef was too wide, no jungle too thick, no ground too uneven. In the field, Marines and soldiers watched the transformation with awe. They had landed on bare beaches under fire. Days later, they were eating in mess halls and sleeping under solid roofs. Air cover grew stronger as new planes arrived. Supplies flowed freely. Felt like an entire city had risen from nothing. For the Seabees, the work was more than engineering. It was combat of a different kind. Bulldozers were sometimes shot at by hidden snipers. Air raids struck construction sites. Men carried rifles slung across their backs while they worked. They built under pressure, knowing the enemy wanted to destroy what they were creating. By the time the first Japanese counterattacks came, the bases were already strong. Anti-aircraft guns were in place, runways were operational, and fuel tanks were full. American planes lifted off to meet the enemy, flying from strips that had been jungle only days earlier. The new harbors allowed ships to refuel and resupply without delay. The speed and efficiency of these builds changed the course of the war. Every island captured became an instant launch point for the next attack. Japanese defenses that relied on isolation and delay began to crumble. Each time the Seabees landed, the cycle repeated: dock, airfield, storage, hospital, done with precision and speed. To the outside observer, it seemed like magic. To the men on the ground, it was simply the result of skill, planning, and relentless effort. What had been considered impossible was now routine. The Pacific Islands were no longer obstacles. They were stepping stones, each one turned into a base almost overnight, built by the men who fought with bulldozers and hammers instead of rifles. In the early years of the war, Japanese planners believed distance was their strongest ally. The Pacific was vast, and they controlled hundreds of islands scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. They knew they could not match the United States in production, so their strategy relied on slowing the American advance until their enemy grew tired of the cost. Every island was to be a fortress, manned by garrisons who would fight to the last man. By forcing the U.S. to attack each position, and by relying on the difficult terrain, they hoped to stretch the war out long enough to negotiate from a position of strength. The assumption behind this plan was simple. Even if the Americans captured an island, it would take them a long time to turn it into a base for the next step forward. In that time, Japanese forces could regroup, reinforce nearby positions, and prepare their defenses. Geography would buy them time. Coral reefs, jungle, and the sheer distance from U.S. supply ports would act as natural barriers. This was the foundation of Japan's defensive perimeter, a line they believed could not be broken quickly. By mid-1943, this belief began to falter. Japanese reconnaissance pilots started reporting unusual developments. On islands recently captured by the Americans, new structures appeared with shocking speed. From the air, they could see piers and floating docks reaching out into the water. Runways stretched across land that had been untouched jungle only weeks earlier. Storage tanks rose like giant cylinders along the shore. At first, Japanese commanders doubted the reports. They believed the pilots were mistaken or that they were misinterpreting what they saw. No one had ever built a harbor or airfield in such a short time. Then the reports became too frequent to ignore. Submarine crews confirmed what the pilots had seen. They surfaced at night and observed the glow of floodlights, the silhouettes of cranes, and the outlines of ships unloading cargo at new docks. Intelligence officers compiled photographs and sketches. They realized the Americans were not just occupying islands. They were transforming them at a pace that defied belief. In one documented case, a Japanese officer described his shock in a diary later captured by U.S. forces. He wrote that he had visited an island that had been under American control for less than a month. In that short time, an entire base had appeared. Large warships docked at piers built from prefabricated pontoons. Aircraft took off and landed continuously on wide coral runways. Trucks moved supplies in endless columns along newly graded roads. He admitted that he could not understand how this was possible. His own engineers would have needed 6 months to do the same work, and even then they would have lacked the machines and materials to finish it properly. This speed struck at the heart of Japan's defensive strategy. Every forward base they lost was supposed to slow the Americans. Instead, the opposite was happening. As soon as the fighting ended, American construction battalions moved in. The Seabees, as they were known, built under fire, often while snipers still hid in the surrounding jungle. Within days, they created operational airfields and functional harbors. What should have been a pause between battles became a rapid launch point for the next assault. Japanese naval leaders received the intelligence reports with growing concern. They understood the implications immediately. The war was no longer a series of separate battles. It was a continuous advance. Every island captured was not just a tactical gain, but also a logistical one. Each new harbor allowed supplies to flow closer to the front. Each new airfield extended the range of American aircraft, putting Japanese positions under constant threat. In practical terms, this meant that counterattacks became nearly impossible. In the past, Japan could launch strikes at isolated American footholds, hoping to cut them off before they became secure. But now, by the time Japanese forces organized a counterattack, the Americans were already entrenched. Aircraft flew from freshly built runways to intercept incoming bombers. Anti-aircraft guns, set up almost overnight, guarded the new bases. Ships refueled and rearmed at the very beaches they had just seized. One Japanese fleet commander described the situation as trying to fight an enemy who carried his own homeland with him. Wherever the Americans went, they brought the means to build a city of war. This frustrated Japanese plans and eroded morale among the officers. The psychological effect was as damaging as the material one. Commanders had to explain to their troops why they were retreating despite brave defenses and heavy sacrifices. The speed of the American buildup also exposed the limits of Japanese industry. Every new photograph of an American base reminded them of their own shortages. They lacked enough bulldozers, cranes, and trucks to match even a fraction of the enemy's efforts. Most of their labor was still done by hand. Their supply ships were fewer, slower, and increasingly vulnerable to American submarines. By late 1943, the Japanese High Command began to receive reports of entire chains of islands lost in rapid succession. At Tarawa, at Macon, and later at Kwajalein, the pattern was the same. First came the Marines and soldiers to seize the ground. Immediately behind them came the Seabees, who built the infrastructure needed to project power further west. The defensive perimeter that had seemed secure now crumbled like paper. In planning rooms across Tokyo, senior officers debated their options. Some argued for concentrating forces to strike a decisive blow. Others urged a withdrawal to shorten the lines. But all agreed on one fact: the Americans had found a way to neutralize distance. The ocean no longer protected Japan. Every island lost brought the war closer to their shores. On the battlefield, this shift played out in brutal clarity. At one newly built base, American planes lifted off just in time to intercept a Japanese naval raid aimed at destroying the harbor. The raid failed because the base had been finished before the attackers could arrive. In another case, Japanese troops prepared to defend an island only to find that their supply lines had already been cut by aircraft operating from a neighboring base built in record time. As the months passed, Japanese soldiers and sailors began to speak of the Seabees with a mix of fear and disbelief. They could not understand how the Americans built so quickly under constant threat. The sight of a completed harbor, bustling with activity only days after a battle, convinced many that they were facing an enemy whose resources were beyond measure. This realization spread through the ranks and reached the highest levels of command. The strategy of attrition that had guided Japan since the start of the war was now in doubt. The Americans were no longer just winning battles. They were reshaping the entire theater of war, one island at a time, with speed and precision that Japan could not match. A Japanese officer stepped off the boat and walked across the narrow beach, his boots sinking into the wet sand. Weeks earlier, this place had been nothing but jungle and broken coral. He had expected to find chaos. Wreckage from battle, a few scattered outposts, maybe a crude shelter for American troops. Instead, he stood in the middle of a working port. Steel piers reached into the ocean where deep-draft ships were tied up, cranes swinging overhead as cargo moved steadily ashore. Trucks rumbled past, hauling crates of ammunition and drums of fuel. He stopped and stared. His escort said nothing. There was nothing to explain. The officer had been told the Americans were fast builders, but this was beyond anything he imagined. In his own army, construction took months. Laborers worked with hand tools and carried timber on their shoulders. Building a single runway required thousands of men and enormous effort. Here, machines did the work at a speed that felt unnatural. He spoke quietly to himself, a phrase barely louder than the waves. "It's not possible." Later that night, in a small notebook, he wrote his impressions by lantern light. He described the white coral runways that stretched across the island like bones. He wrote about the storage tanks standing in neat rows, each one large enough to hold a river of fuel. He drew a quick sketch of the floating docks, locked together in precise lines. At the bottom of the page, he added a single sentence: "If this continues, we cannot hold out." Other officers wrote similar reports. In staff rooms in Tokyo, senior commanders read them in silence. At first, there was anger. Some accused the pilots and scouts of exaggeration. Others blamed local garrisons for failing to stop the Americans before they built these bases. But as more evidence came in, photographs, intercepted radio traffic, captured documents, the truth became clear. The Americans were not just fighting battles. They were creating a moving network of ports, airfields, and supply depots that followed them wherever they went. The realization was crushing. Many officers had believed in victory even after the defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal. They thought that determination and sacrifice could balance the difference in resources. Now they saw that no amount of courage could match the industrial scale of their enemy. Japan could not replace ships and planes as quickly as the United States built them. Even as their own bases fell silent, new American ones appeared overnight. Some officers hid their despair, speaking only of renewed effort and glorious resistance. Others were more honest in private. In letters never meant to be read outside trusted circles, they admitted that the war might already be lost. They did not dare speak these words in meetings, but the knowledge weighed on them. For the men on the ground, the reaction was more immediate. Japanese soldiers stationed on nearby islands watched the transformation with disbelief. From a distance, they saw the coastline change almost daily. A week after the fighting ended, planes were taking off from runways that had not existed before. Fuel dumps burned under American flags where jungle had been. The sight was demoralizing in a way no battle could match. Across the line, the American side told a different story. The Seabees who built these bases took pride in their work. Many had come from civilian jobs, construction crews, shipyards, factories, and now wore Navy uniforms. They carried rifles slung across their backs while they operated bulldozers and cranes. They knew they were targets. Snipers often fired at them from the treeline. Mortar shells landed without warning. There were stories told among the Marines about bulldozer operators who kept working even as shots cracked past their heads. One man cleared a path through a minefield while infantry provided cover. Another stayed at his controls during a bombing raid, determined to finish grading a strip so planes could land. These men were not reckless. They simply understood the urgency. Without a working harbor and airfield, frontline troops could not be supplied, and wounded men could not be evacuated. The relationship between the Seabees and the combat units was close. Marines and sailors depended on them for everything from fresh water to spare parts. When the Seabees arrived on a newly secured beach, morale lifted. Their presence meant food, mail, and a path home for the wounded. It also meant that the fight would soon move forward, leaving that island behind as a secure base. In camp at night, after the day's work, the Seabees and Marines shared meals and stories. They built crude tables from scrap wood and sat side by side, eating from tin mess kits. The Marines respected the builders because they risked their lives in a different way. They fought with machines and hammers instead of rifles, but they fought all the same. For the Japanese watching from a distance, this teamwork was invisible. They saw only the results. A harbor alive with activity, a sky filled with enemy aircraft, a beach lined with supply ships. To them, it seemed like magic, as if the Americans had conjured entire cities from the sea. When captured reports and diaries reached higher command, the impact was profound. Maps once marked with strong defensive positions now showed gaps where those positions had vanished. The perimeter that was supposed to contain the enemy was shrinking by the week. Each new base built by the Seabees pushed American bombers and warships closer to Japan's heartland. Some Japanese officers continued to speak of final battles and ultimate sacrifice. Others fell silent, unwilling to voice the truth they felt in their bones. The enemy's strength was not only in numbers or weapons, but in the ability to move forward without pause. Where the Japanese saw obstacles, the Americans built solutions. On the beaches and in the jungle, the proof was there for anyone to see. Empty coastlines became harbors. Swamps became runways. Small, scattered outposts turned into powerful hubs of war. For the Japanese officers who witnessed this transformation firsthand, the shock was lasting. Their first reaction was disbelief. Their final reaction was a grim acceptance that they faced a foe whose power seemed limitless and whose progress could not be stopped by courage alone. By late 1943, the pace of the war in the Pacific had changed. In the first 2 years, the fighting had been slow and costly. Each island captured came only after heavy losses, and then weeks of delay followed as the Americans struggled to bring in supplies. That pattern no longer held. With the Seabees building bases almost as fast as the Marines and soldiers could take them, the United States no longer needed to attack every stronghold. The new strategy was called leapfrogging. Instead of battering against every fortified island, American commanders chose key targets and bypassed the rest. An island with a Japanese garrison might be left behind, cut off from supplies, while U.S. forces moved to seize a position further along the chain. The Seabees made this possible. Each time they built a harbor and an airfield, it became a launch point for the next step. This shift had immediate effects. Supply lines shortened with every capture. Fuel, ammunition, and food no longer had to travel thousands of miles from Pearl Harbor or the West Coast. Instead, they moved from one newly built base to another. Ships could refuel and reload at forward positions, and aircraft could stage from runways much closer to the enemy. Operations that once seemed impossible became routine. At Tarawa, the fighting was fierce and the cost high. But within days of the battle's end, American engineers had turned the atoll into a functioning airstrip. From there, planes struck the next set of islands, softening defenses before the landings began. Kwajalein, the same pattern followed. The Seabees arrived right behind the combat troops, clearing ground and laying down crushed coral to form runways. By the time Japanese forces attempted to organize a response, the Americans were already ready to move again. This constant forward motion confused and disoriented the Japanese high command. Their defensive plan depended on time. Each island was meant to buy weeks or months for the next to prepare. Now that timeline collapsed. Reports reached Tokyo describing American bases that seemed to rise from the ocean overnight. Garrison commanders sent desperate messages begging for reinforcements that never came. In many cases, reinforcements were ordered to islands that had already been bypassed and rendered useless. As the Americans advanced, heavily fortified islands that had once seemed critical were simply left behind. Truk, a massive Japanese base once considered the Gibraltar of the Pacific, was surrounded rather than stormed. With nearby airfields built by the Seabees, U.S. planes pounded Truk from the air until it was effectively neutralized. Its garrison, cut off and starving, could do nothing to influence the course of the war. The psychological effect on Japanese leadership was severe. Senior officers had built their strategy on the belief that fortified positions could slow the enemy. They had assured the emperor and the people of Japan that these islands were secure. Now they watched as those same positions fell in rapid succession or were simply ignored. In meetings, tempers flared. Some commanders argued for a final decisive battle, pouring everything into one massive strike. Others urged retreat to save what forces remained. Beneath the arguments lay a growing sense of despair. They understood that the United States had solved the problem of distance. The vast Pacific, which they had counted on as a shield, no longer protected them. For the troops on the ground, morale began to crumble. Soldiers stationed on bypassed islands knew they had been left to wither. They watched from the shore as American planes flew overhead and American ships sailed past without stopping. Supplies dwindled. Hunger and disease spread. Many realized they would never be rescued. Even on islands still in the fight, the sight of American bases springing up so quickly was demoralizing. A garrison might fight for weeks to defend one position, only to learn that another base had been built behind them, ready to strike at their rear. The sense of being overwhelmed grew stronger with each passing month. As the Americans pressed westward, the new bases supported ever larger operations. In 1944, they played a key role in the liberation of the Philippines. Seabees built runways and harbors on captured islands, allowing massive fleets and air groups to operate close to Luzon and Leyte. These bases fed the campaign that drove Japanese forces from their former stronghold. Later, in early 1945, the same process repeated on an even larger scale at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The ability to land, build, and strike again without delay gave the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps unprecedented reach. By the time the Japanese realized where the next blow would fall, the Americans were already preparing the ground. The speed of construction had another effect. It gave American commanders freedom to choose their targets. They no longer had to rely on existing harbors or natural terrain. With the Seabees able to build from nothing, any island could become a base. This made Japanese predictions difficult and their defensive planning almost impossible. Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur both recognized the value of this new mobility. Their campaigns were coordinated to keep constant pressure on Japan from multiple directions. One leap came from the Central Pacific, another from the Southwest Pacific, and both moved forward step by step. The Japanese could not match this pace. Their supply lines were stretched thin and their shipping was under constant attack from American submarines. Every attempt to reinforce or resupply a threatened island ended in disaster. Meanwhile, the Americans moved forward with growing strength, each victory feeding the next. In Tokyo, intelligence officers plotted the progress on maps. Red pins marked lost islands. Blue pins marked new American bases. The blue pins moved steadily closer to Japan itself. Even the most optimistic leaders could see the pattern. The perimeter was collapsing. The realization sank in slowly but deeply. No matter how fiercely their troops fought, the enemy's advance could not be stopped. Every loss gave the Americans another platform to strike. Each new harbor built by the Seabees shortened the distance to Japan's heartland. By mid-1944, the war's outcome was becoming clear to those who studied the reports. The defensive line was no longer a line at all, but a series of isolated pockets surrounded and cut off. The Americans were not just winning battles. They were reshaping the Pacific, turning once remote islands into stepping stones that led straight to the Japanese home islands. The speed and reach of this campaign left the Japanese high command with fewer options each month. Their strategy of attrition had failed. The enemy was not pausing, not slowing, not giving them time to breathe. With every new harbor and runway built, the Americans moved closer to Japan's shores, while the defenders fell back, unable to stop the tide. When the war ended, the work of the Seabees stood across the Pacific as silent proof of what they had done. Islands that had once been empty stretches of coral and jungle now held harbors, runways, and entire towns built from the ground up. Their motto, "We build, we fight," was more than words. It was visible in every pier driven into the sea and every airstrip laid over crushed coral. The immediate legacy of their efforts was clear. The United States had fought a war across the largest ocean on Earth and won because it could sustain its forces at great distances. Ships sailed forward without fear of running out of fuel or supplies. Planes had places to land, refuel, and strike deeper into enemy territory. This was only possible because the Seabees followed each wave of combat troops, ready to turn bare ground into a functioning base within days. In many campaigns, victory depended as much on their speed as on the outcome of the initial battle. Marines and sailors who fought in the Pacific remembered the moment the Seabees arrived. For men living in foxholes and tents, seeing bulldozers and cranes come ashore meant relief. It meant food and fresh water. It meant hospitals for the wounded and safe docks for ships carrying reinforcements. For frontline troops, the builders became a symbol of hope and progress. They knew that once the Seabees began their work, the island was secure and the fight was moving forward. The engineering techniques developed during those years did not vanish when the guns fell silent. The experience of building in remote, hostile environments forced innovation. Prefabricated parts became standard. Floating docks and portable fuel systems were refined for speed and efficiency. These methods shaped military engineering for decades to come. In later wars and even during peacetime, the lessons learned in the Pacific were applied again and again. In the years that followed, the Seabees found new missions. Many of the men who had built bases under fire stayed in uniform or passed their skills on to the next generation. Their work became part of disaster response efforts around the world. When hurricanes or earthquakes destroyed infrastructure, the same techniques once used to build wartime harbors were used to bring relief supplies to remote or damaged areas. The ability to create order from chaos, to build quickly with limited resources, proved just as valuable in peace as it had in war. Some of the structures built during the war never went away. Many runways carved out of coral were paved and expanded after the fighting ended. They became commercial airports or permanent military installations. Harbors built for amphibious landings were later used by fishing fleets, cargo ships, and civilian ferries. On certain islands, a visitor can still see the original foundations of Seabee construction, the steel and concrete weathered but intact after decades of use. For Japan, the memory of these rapid builds carried a different weight. The sight of entire bases appearing almost overnight left a deep impression. To many Japanese officers and civilians, it came to symbolize the overwhelming power of the United States and the futility of resistance once that power was fully mobilized. Even after the surrender, stories of those moments circulated quietly among veterans and historians. They served as reminders of how quickly the balance of the war had shifted and how completely the old defensive strategies had failed. In the United States, the story became one of determination and ingenuity. The Seabees were celebrated not only for their skill but also for their willingness to fight when needed. They were builders first, but they carried rifles and took their place alongside the Marines and soldiers they supported. This dual role captured the spirit of the Pacific Campaign. Men who fought not only to destroy but to create, turning each captured island into a bridge to the next. The Seabees' reputation grew in the post-war years as veterans told their stories and as military planners studied their achievements. Training programs were shaped by what they had learned on those islands. Equipment was redesigned with mobility and speed in mind. The very idea of modern expeditionary engineering, the ability to build anywhere, under any conditions, came directly from their wartime experience. In towns and cities across America, returning Seabees brought their skills home. They built houses, schools, and factories with the same precision they had once applied to airfields and docks. In many ways, they helped fuel the post-war construction boom, carrying lessons learned under fire into civilian life. Their work overseas and at home left a lasting mark on both military and civilian infrastructure. The memory of what they accomplished remains visible in the Pacific. From the Marianas to the Philippines, from tiny atolls to major islands, traces of their labor still stand. A pier that once held troopships now serves local fishermen. A runway first used by warplanes now carries commercial flights. These structures are more than relics. They are living parts of communities that grew from the foundations laid during those intense years. For those who study the history of the war, these bases represent more than engineering feats. They tell the story of a turning point when the Pacific Campaign shifted irreversibly. They show how the ability to build, move, and sustain operations shaped the outcome of the conflict. The Seabees' legacy lives on not only in the physical structures they left behind, but also in the strategies and methods that continue to influence how militaries and relief organizations operate today. Even now, decades later, their presence can be felt. The islands where they worked are no longer battlefields, but the impact of their efforts remains in every harbor and every runway that traces its origins back to those desperate, demanding days of war.